case number 12CR 1522. The record should reflect that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys, and the same prosecutors plus Mr. Brockler are present now. I took the last objection by Ms. Brady under advisement, and I, over the break, looked at Lockett versus State, which is cited at 53 Pacific 3rd 418. And then I looked at United States versus McVeigh, 153 F 3rd 1166, which was cited by Stitch McGuire. I am familiar with McVeigh. I was not as familiar with Lockett, or familiar with Lockett, I should say. I didn't find any specific reference in McVeigh to the objection that was raised, which is with respect to any statements related to a victim's future plans. In Lockett, the court said, appellant first claims that the victim impact statement was unfairly prejudicial as it included statements about the victim's childhood and her future plans. It is true that statements about a victim's childhood have no relevance in victim impact evidence. It is also true that statements about the victim's plans for the future may not have been relevant victim impact evidence. So the court said may not have been relevant victim impact evidence, and did not provide any explanation or analysis for that statement. It did cite to a case by the name of Phillips versus State, which is another case from the Oklahoma Criminal Court of Appeals, 989 Pacific 2nd 1017. So I pulled that case in Phillips versus State, which is a 1999 case. By the way, Lockett is a 2002 case from the same court. In Phillips, the court said as follows: while the witness's statements concerning her desires for her son's future were speculative and may not have been relevant victim impact evidence, their admission did not prevent the jury from fulfilling its function in the second stage of the trial. Again, there's not any analysis or explanation, but it seems like, at least in Phillips, it was the mother of the victim who was attempting to, or who did testify about her desires for her son's future, what she wanted for her son's future. I can see how that's not relevant, and I can see how that's inadmissible. I also can understand how speculative evidence is not proper victim impact evidence. So just having a witness, for example, say, well, I heard him once say that he wanted to be XYZ, I think that's speculative and it is irrelevant. On the other hand, if one of the victims had on more than one occasion indicated something about what he or she wanted to be in the future and actually taken steps toward that future, toward that goal, for example, by enrolling in school, or by doing specific type of work, or by getting specific type of training. If a victim had future plans, concrete future plans, and they had taken steps toward those plans or in relation to those plans, then I think that is admissible victim impact evidence, because it goes to the individual characteristics of the victim, who the victim was, as well as the loss to society or to the community, which is what Payne talks about. So that's the difference I draw. So it depends on the situation. It's not appropriate to have someone speculate. It's not appropriate to have someone say what he or she wanted for the victim in the future. It's not appropriate to introduce evidence of what a victim wanted to do in the future if there were not concrete plans and this was a statement that had been made in passing or something along those lines. But if the victim had concrete plans and had taken steps toward those concrete plans, then I think that is appropriate victim impact evidence. So the objection for now is overruled in part and sustained in part, and it'll just depend on the evidence that is introduced. Are the parties ready for the jury? One of our jurors was just making her way into the courtroom into the courthouse when I took the bench, so they should be about ready now. Are the people ready for the jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, is the defense ready? Okay, let's bring the jury in, please. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury is now present in the courtroom. Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? Okay, you got to sleep in today. I hope that helps. Thanks for coming back today. I appreciate that. As you know, the next step in the proceedings is phase 3 of the sentencing hearing. And so the first thing I'm going to do is read to you some introductory instructions. And so I'm going to have my staff distribute a copy of the introductory instructions to each of you at this time and ask each of you to follow along as I read them to you here in court. When I'm done reading them, we will retrieve the copies from you, so please don't make any notes or markings on these copies because we will take them back from you, okay? Thank you, Ms. Gerlings. Does everyone have a copy? You're missing one? Oh, okay. Does everyone have a copy now? Great. Everyone's nodding their head yes and saying yes. All right. Phase 3, introductory instruction number 1. Members of the jury, it now becomes your duty to determine the appropriate punishment or sentence to be imposed on the defendant for each crime of murder in the first degree. Your verdicts in the trial and your sentencing verdicts in the first 2 phases of the sentencing hearing do not in any way require you to vote to impose a death sentence on any of the counts of murder in the first degree. A death sentence is still never mandatory or required by law. The outcome of your deliberations at the end of the trial, at the end of phase 1 of the sentencing hearing, and at the end of phase 2 of the sentencing hearing do not govern the ultimate determination that you must make as to whether the defendant should be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or death. The question of punishment still remains unresolved. Phase 3 introductory instruction number 2. In phase 3 of the sentencing hearing, There may be additional evidence presented by the prosecution and the defense. At the conclusion of this case, with respect to each count of murder in the first degree, each of you will be asked to individually decide whether or not you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that death is the appropriate sentence. In reaching your final sentencing verdict on each count, each of you must make an individual reasoned moral judgment. The exercise of your individual reasoned moral judgment must be based on the evidence and information presented during the trial and the sentencing hearing. Each juror may consider mercy and sympathy for the defendant, but mercy and sympathy must be based on the evidence and information presented during the trial and the sentencing hearing. Each of the jury's final sentencing verdicts must reflect a profoundly reasoned moral response to the defendant's background, character, history, and the crimes of murder in the first degree. No juror may make a decision for the death penalty unless the juror is convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that death is the appropriate sentence. Further, if one or more jurors are not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that death is the appropriate sentence, the defendant will be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A juror need not be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that life imprisonment without the possibility of parole is the appropriate sentence in order to make a decision that will result in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Phase 3, Introductory Instruction Number 3. The defendant may present evidence and information in Phase 3 of the sentencing hearing on his own behalf, but he's not required to do so. The defendant is never under an obligation to present evidence or information or to prove or disprove anything. Phase 3, Introductory Instruction Number 4. In Phase 3 of the sentencing hearing, there is no burden of proof. Therefore, neither party has the burden to prove anything to you. The fact that a party may choose to present evidence in Phase 3 does not change this rule. Similarly, the fact that a party may choose not to present evidence in Phase 3 does not change this rule. While neither party has a burden of proof in Phase 3, the degree of certainty that is defined as beyond a reasonable doubt nevertheless applies in this phase of the sentencing hearing. A juror may not determine that a death sentence is appropriate unless he or she is convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that death is the appropriate sentence. Thus, in Phase 3, the use of the term beyond a reasonable doubt refers to the level of moral certainty that an individual juror is required to have before he or she may decide, based on his or her individual reasoned moral judgment, that death is the appropriate sentence. Phase 3, Introductory Instruction Number 5. In Phase 3, you may receive evidence commonly known as victim impact evidence. This is evidence of any matters relating to the personal characteristics of the deceased victims and the impact of the crimes of murder in the first degree on each victim's family. The purpose of such evidence is to inform you about the harm caused by the crimes of murder in the first degree. You may consider this evidence in reaching your final sentencing verdicts. However, your consideration must be limited to a moral inquiry into the culpability of the defendant, not an emotional response to the evidence. Phase 3, Introductory Instruction Number 6. In reaching your final sentencing verdicts, you must treat the defendant as a uniquely individual human being. Further, you must not be influenced by prejudice or bias of any sort against the defendant or the prosecution, and you must not consider any public opinion or community sentiment for or against the defendant or the prosecution. Your decisions in Phase 3 of the sentencing hearing may not be the result of any irrational or arbitrary emotional response. Rather, each of your final sentencing verdicts must reflect your individual reasoned moral determination. Phase 3, Introductory Instruction Number 7. The court will provide you further instructions at the end of Phase 3. Any decision regarding the appropriate sentence and each count of murder in the first degree must be reserved until the sentencing hearing is completed and you have received the court's final instructions of law. It is your sworn obligation to withhold any judgment and decline to form or start forming any opinion until I tell you that you may start deliberating. Then, and only then, may you begin to deliberate. All right, that concludes the Phase 3 introductory instructions. Ms. Robinson or Ms. Gerlings, if you would please collect those copies from the jury. Do we have them all, Ms. Gerlings? Yes, great. All right. The prosecution may call its first witness if it has any evidence to present.
May we present an opening statement, Your Honor?
Would counsel approach, please? The attorneys reminded me that I have allowed them 2 minutes for opening statements. So, Mr. Brockler, you may proceed.
Thank you. A father, a daughter, an ex-husband, a widow, a sister, a grandfather, and moms. After hundreds of witnesses to discuss the crime itself and mental health and guilt, after a week and dozens of witnesses to talk about him, you will now finally get to hear from a handful of people with a handful of stories and a handful of pictures and videos from right here to give you a glimpse as to who those people are in the pictures, the ones he shot to death. And you'll get just the faintest of whiffs of the impact on those that are left behind. This is done so that you can have a complete picture, and that when this phase is over, probably tomorrow, you can go back, factor this in with all else that you've heard, all else that you know, and all else that you've found, and come back and render the only appropriate sentence in this case, and that is death.
Thank you, Ms. Higgs.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the final phase of this long trial, and this is where each of you individually must make that moral determination in your mind, in your heart, and square with your conscience as to the appropriate sentence for this young man, James Egan Holmes. Are you convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that death is the appropriate sentence for this man who suffered a psychotic break that led to these deaths? Or is life without the possibility of parole for this young man who has an illness that he didn't ask for, an illness that he struggled to fix? Is life in a prison cell without ever being released a sufficient punishment? And we say yes. The evidence that you will hear today and tomorrow will be heartbreaking and tragic. And it is the kind of evidence that can take hold of you. And it is okay to feel that grief and sadness. We will all feel it. But the law requires that you not be swayed by that emotion, that you not let the emotion for those families overwhelm your decision-making process, your reasoned moral judgment. That evidence is only for your consideration in a moral inquiry into the moral culpability of a mentally ill man. Now, you also cannot let the other very important decisions you've made throughout this trial dictate what comes next. Because even where aggravation outweighs mitigation, the law never requires the sentence of death. Life without the possibility of ever being released is a satisfactory and severe punishment. And it's not about weighing. It's about each of you looking within yourselves and looking at your individual reasoned moral judgment and using your compassion and your mercy that you brought here to this courtroom. And you deciding. And ladies and gentlemen, it is a decision you will have to live with for the rest of your lives. And you have heard who this young man has been all of his life. And you know that the only rational decision...
Sustain. Wrap up, please.
Thank you. The only rational explanation here is a psychotic break and a mental illness. We will ask that you not answer death with death, but that you render a fair and merciful verdict of life without the possibility of parole.
Thank you. Call your first witness, please, Ms. Pearson.
Your Honor, the people call Robert Wingo.
Good morning. Could I have you raise your right hand for me, please, so that I can administer an oath? Do you solemnly swear or affirm, under penalty of law, that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Okay, please be seated. Could you please tell us your full name for the record and spell your first, middle, and last names?
Robert O'Neill Wingo Jr. It's Robert O''Nealllwingo Jr. Jr. Period.
Mr. Wingo, if you could pull that microphone up to your mouth, you can move it around so that it's easier for you and so you can speak up so that everybody can hear you, okay?
You can move your chair and you can also move the microphone so that it's close to you. Okay. All right, you may proceed.
Mr. Wingo, did you know Rebecca Wingo?
Yes, ma'am.
And how did you know her?
I was married to her for about 8, almost 9 years.
And I'm going to ask you to speak up a little more, to pull the microphone closer. You're kind of soft-spoken. So if I could have up Exhibit 4729 that was previously admitted into evidence. Do you know the person that's in this photograph?
Yes, that's Rebecca.
That's Rebecca. Thank you. You can take it down. Could you tell us how you first met Rebecca Wingo?
I met Rebecca in about 1998. We were in Monterey, California. We were both in the Air Force at the time at the Defense Language Institute. She was a Mandarin Chinese linguist, and we specifically were in the chow hall, and she just jumped out of line and kind of gave me the eyes and said, "Hey."
I'm going to ask you still to speak up a little more. I think it's very difficult to hear you. So you were both at the Defense Language Institute in California, and were you also learning a language at that time?
Yes, ma'am. I was a Serbian-Croatian linguist.
So she approached you first?
Yes, ma'am.
What about her was attractive to you? What was she like?
The energy about her, she had a huge smile. She was fearless and wild, yet cultured and intelligent. And that juxtaposition of things was quite intriguing to me.
Did she end up doing work involving learning Chinese?
She did. She worked for a time in a number of sites, from Kenya to here, Buckley, and also in Texas, and a small time again in Monterey.
What did she do with the Chinese language that she learned in the Air Force?
I think the byline is to translate target language.
Was she good at her job?
She was good at her job, and she made it look pretty effortless.
So you met her in the late 90s in Monterey, California. When did you get married?
It was in 1999 here in Colorado.
Now, after you'd been in California, were you both stationed together when you were married somewhere else?
After I had gotten out, we went to Oahu. She was stationed at Hickam but worked at Kenya, and we were there for a number of years.
In Hawaii?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you have children together?
2 children. Jalen, she's now 12, and Jewel, she's 8 years old now.
2 girls?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
When was Jalen born?
9/24/2002, and Jewel is 3/22/2007.
What grades are your kids in now?
I'll be going into the 8th grade and 3rd grade.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
I'm going to approach you with a photograph that's marked as Exhibit 4728. Do you recognize the people depicted in this photograph?
Yes, ma'am.
And who are they?
This is Rebecca, Jewel, and Jalen.
Your Honor, I'd move for the admittance of People's Exhibit. I'm sorry, I don't remember what number I said.
P-TR-4728.
I'd move for admittance of the photograph.
Is there any objection?
Nothing additional, Your Honor.
All right, based on my prior record, it is admitted and it may be published.
If I could have it up, please. Could you tell us which child is sitting on which side of Rebecca?
On the left side is Jewel. At the time, she was about 5 and just starting kindergarten. And on the right is Jalen. And at the time, I think she was in the 4th grade.
Do you know when this photograph was taken?
Looking at the dresses, I think this was Valentine's Day, 2014.
Do you mean 2012?
2012, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. When you can take that down. What was Rebecca like as a mother?
As a mother, she was the fun mom. She did not hover. She was the one that always encouraged them to explore and be confident in what they wanted to do. And she was the good time. Whereas on the other side of that coin, I was probably the one that was a little more conservative, so it made for a good mixed parenting in different locations. But she was very loving. She was always the one that would have the music turned up, and they're singing songs together, and maybe they'll have ice cream for dinner. She was that kind of mom.
Did you have different parenting styles?
We did, but we were able to talk through those things and make it work for that situation.
Was she a good role model for your kids?
Absolutely. As I said before, she was fearless and intelligent, strong-willed, and those are some of the things that, while they've been instilled in the kids, it's that's not a model that they have on a day-to-day basis anymore. So that's a tremendous impact.
Now, you were stationed in Hawaii when she was still in the military at that time?
That's correct.
Had you gotten out of the military?
Yes, ma'am. I was doing contract work for the Navy Marine Corps.
Who do you work for now?
I work for Department of Homeland Security, specifically Citizenship and Immigration Service.
At some point, did you both move back to Colorado?
Yes, after we had decided we were going to separate and divorce, we picked Colorado because we had previously been here. She had a short tour here before Hawaii, and it was a central location to Colorado, North Carolina, and Texas, which are the locations where our respective families were based.
Did you live near each other?
About 3 or 4 miles away, we were flanking the schools so that when we would split the front half and the back half of the week, logistically things would work out.
Were you able to get along co-parenting after your divorce?
We had an extreme, love-hate relationship, and but it worked, and so we were able to make it work.
Did she get out of the military at some point?
She did. Right before we came back to Colorado, she got out and she started to pursue, obviously finishing her degree, ultimately concrete finite plans, working towards being a social worker or working in that field, and all of the activities associated with that, including volunteering, other things that she would do with the girls, finding food banks, things with her church, things that were beneficial to the community, and examples for how and what the girls should do.
What was she doing for work in July of 2012?
At that time, she was working for Shriver Medical. I'm not sure of the specific activities, but I think it was an admin type position while she was in school.
Now, you said that you had a front end and back end of the week in terms of how you split up time with your kids?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
So when did she have the kids and when did you have the kids?
So she was on the front end of the week, meaning that Wednesday she would take them to school. I would pick them up on Wednesday, and then the weekends would alternate. So that basically resulted in the 50-50 time, and we would adjust as needed if there were issues that came up.
At the time of the shooting, did you have the children then?
I did.
How did you learn about what had happened at the theater?
When news first struck, I received a call or a text from an old friend indicating that their older child had been at a different theater but had heard about a shooting that had taken place. As news started to roll in, and I had a Facebook account at the time, people started to inquire because they knew we were in Colorado, and again, specifically Aurora. When additional details came out that it was the Century 16, I was at that time a bit relieved because I had known that she was going, but we had never, or I had never known her to go to that theater very often. Although I knew her and a friend were going to be going. So I had posted at the time that, the girls and I were okay, and I was not too concerned with Rebecca at that point because I figured it wasn't the case, but I could not get confirmation of that.
Did you later learn that she was in fact at the theater?
Indeed. At the time, my ex-girlfriend and I were at a Walmart, and received a call from Rebecca's mother, frantic, indicating that she thought Rebecca had been hurt, and she couldn't find her, and which was uncharacteristic of her to call in that way. And at that time still I thought that maybe she just had had a night and the phone died, and so we started looking. As events carried on, obviously things did not pan out, but logistically my best friend had gone to, because the children had gone to school, I had taken them. He went to pick them up, and during that interim, my ex-girlfriend and I were searching everywhere, calling everywhere. We had gone to the high school, and slowly but surely, all of the families started to gather in the area, and we were given not good news, but not specific news. But it started to look really bad at that point, and that's when they released us. We went back home, and my best friend, my ex-girlfriend, and I sat the girls down because he had taken them to a jumping facility to have fun, just a little fun time. They thought it was interesting that Mr. Jose had come pick them up and they would have fun. And that's where I let them know that that Mom had died that day. Not in such a succinct fashion, but the reaction was that my oldest daughter, who was, I think, 9 at the time, absolutely registered and fell apart. The news hit her very hard. My youngest daughter did not quite understand what was really happening, and which in itself had its own gravity. So that's the short story.
What has it been like for your daughters to have lost their mother?
It's a huge impact, obviously. There is no more of that other half of the week. There's no more of the fun time with Mom, the infectious spirit, the type of strong female that she was, that she showed them by example. That's gone. But more intimately, the relationship with a mother is our first one. And to have it torn in that kind of fashion is obviously particularly impacting. Since then, they've obviously gotten older. My younger daughter has a greater faculty in terms of expressing herself and understanding the dynamics of the situation, so that presents problems in new ways, and we've had to adjust for that. My older daughter is a preteen, and along with that comes the typical stresses. They had kind of a triad of things because of the situation. Their mother died, their grandmother moved away. My long-term...
Your Honor, we'd object under 403.
Sustained. Ask your next question, please.
For you, having had to become a single parent, how did this impact you? How did her death impact your life?
A part-time parent, and 50% of the time to go to 100% of the time is about 150% increase. That is obviously comical math, but that's very much what it's been. It's been very difficult, but there's been lots of support. There's you have to put a weight. Let me just get some water.
Sure.
put a weight on different people that maybe they shouldn't have, or that they didn't necessarily, but the dynamic changes so much that the whole plan really gets thrown off and you have to scrap everything and start over. So in terms of friends, family, support system, it's a lot of stress. It's a lot of new roles thrust upon everyone, but particularly for the girls, it's disorienting in every way, emotional, physically. It's one thing to just all of a sudden never go back to, mommy's house and have mommy there. So stressful in that sense.
What do you tell your daughters about their mother? The things that you think are most important for them to know about who she was as a person?
Your Honor, we'd object under hearsay.
Sustained. Sustained also under Rule 403.
What are the biggest things about Rebecca that you remember?
Probably personality. She was always the central personality to whatever situation she was in. And that could have been, a comedy club or the library or a soup kitchen. She was a very big personality and a kind heart, very loving, and that was something that was big for the girls.
Thank you.
Do you have any cross-examination?
No, sir, I don't.
All right, and the jury does not appear to have any questions for this witness. May this witness be released from his subpoena, Ms. Pearson?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, sir.
All right, sir, thank you. Call your next witness, please, Mr. Orman.
Your Honor, if I may, we have another red light on the mic.
Oh, okay. Do we have any batteries? Thank you. Mr. Orman, go ahead.
Tom Sullivan, Your Honor.
Sullivan, good morning. Could I have you raise your right hand so that I can administer an oath? Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of law that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Okay, please be seated. Could you please tell us your full name for the record and spell your first, middle, and last names?
My name is Leo Thomas Sullivan III, Leothomas Sullivan.
Mr. Orman, you may proceed with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, what name do you go by?
Tom.
Your middle name?
Yes.
You were the father of one of the homicide victims in this case. Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury which one that was?
I'm the father of Alex Sullivan.
Can we please put up previously admitted exhibit 4678, ma'am? Who is that?
That's my son, Alex.
Thank you, ma'am. And what was his legal name?
Alex Matthew Sullivan.
What did his friends call him?
His friends called him Sully.
I want to ask you some questions about your son, about the impact that the defendant's crime had on you and your family. But first, I want to ask you to tell us about Alex Sullivan. What kind of a man was he?
Well, I mean, it's great. I mean, he was, maybe every father's dream. I mean, as a man, you want a son, and Alex was my son, and he was also my best friend. So, that was a two-banger. That was, everything. And so we were able to do so much, together. There was never anywhere that I went. When you have a child, sometimes it changes you. And I can honestly tell you that it didn't change me because I took him everywhere. There wasn't anywhere I couldn't go without taking him, and I did.
Let me ask you to tell us, if you could, describe his personality.
Well, he was empathetic. He was compassionate. He was funny. He was, maybe the life of the party, but he was also one of those who, if you were having a bad day, if things weren't working out for you, he had that sense, and he could come over to you and make you feel better.
Let me ask you a little bit about you. What do you do for a living, sir?
I'm a retired postal worker, and presently I'm on the executive board with the Colorado AFL-CIO.
A union man.
Yes, very much so.
Your son, what did he do for a living?
At the time, he was working at the Red Robin. He was a bartender and was getting ready to go into some type of management training. And he was also working at the Movie Tavern as a bartender there. But in both places he had worked, he was trying to get the whole impact of the food service industry. So he had worked as a chef, he had worked in the back, he had been a server, working as a bartender. He was trying to learn the whole business.
Where did he grow up? What town did he grow up in?
Oh, in Aurora. Yeah, we've lived here our entire lives.
Where did he go to high school?
Grandview. I believe he was in the first class that went all 4 years at Grandview.
Was faith important to you and your family?
Very much, yeah.
How about
Maybe even more than I had thought it was. It was just what we did.
How about to Alex, your son?
Judge, can we approach, please?
Yes. The objection's overruled. Mr. Orman, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Sullivan, I think where we were was I was asking you about the role that faith played in your son's life.
Towards the end, we were both my wife Terry and I were both, brought up as Catholics. And of course, when the kids were born, we both had them baptized. But then it kind of fell off, and we didn't, as we would go to church occasionally, we didn't follow through with the rest of their sacraments. So Alex had never had the opportunity to get confirmed and then be able to receive his first communion. So there was two of his grandparents back in Rochester had passed away, and we had gone back there for their funerals. And my wife has a big family.
Judge, I'm going to object 401 and 403.
May we approach, Your Honor?
Yes. right, Mr. Orman, you may proceed.
Thank you. You were talking about this adult event that happened with your son. Was he able to take communion then?
Not initially, and
Okay, let me just ask you a few pointed questions here. As a result of that, did he decide to invest himself in his religious faith as an adult?
yes,
And what did he do to do that?
he began to go to an adult education class at St. Michael's and got himself confirmed and then had the ability to receive First Communion.
And how old was he when he got confirmed?
26.
You mentioned your family. Did your son have a sister growing up?
Yes, Sister Megan.
And what was the age difference between them?
They were Irish twins. They're 16 months apart.
Is that a thing? I've never heard that before.
Yes, it is a thing.
And anybody else in the household then, other than your wife and his sister Megan and Alex?
It's just the four of us.
I want to ask you a few brief questions about the relationship that your son had with his sister Megan. Can you describe that for the jury, the relationship they had as brother and sister?
Well, Alex was Megan's first best friend. They were together all of the time. We joke that Megan didn't have to speak until she was 5 because Alex did all of the talking for her. We have neighbors that still refer to her as my sister Megan because that's the only way they ever heard her name was because if Megan needed anything or anybody spoke to her, Alex was right there next to him to tell them what it is that she needed.
How about his mother? Can you tell me about the relationship between Alex and his mother?
Well, it was her first. I mean, he's our first child, so there was always, that love and care, and he got a lot of his empathy and compassion, from her, and as he kept getting bigger and bigger, he would overwhelm her, and that's one of the things that is gone from her is the big hugs that she would always get from Alex to let her know that things would be okay.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness with 3 marked exhibits would have been marked for identification as People's Exhibit 4675, 4676, and 4677.
Yes.
Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to ask you to take a look at those and tell me if you recognize the person or people in those photographs.
Yes, I do.
And do those photographs all show your son, Alex Sullivan?
Yes, they do.
And do they show the way he looked around the year of his death?
Yes, he's smiling in every single one of them.
And the last one, 4677, there's another person in there. Who's that?
That's me.
Your Honor, I move to admit 4675, 4676, and 4677.
Is there any objection, Ms. Brady?
Nothing additional.
All right, based on my prior rulings, P-TR-4675 through 4677 inclusive are admitted and may be published.
Can we please put up 4675, ma'am? It looks like maybe it was taken on a golf course. Did your son play golf?
He had worked at a golf course for a while, but that's very possible, yeah.
And 4676?
Yeah, it looks like he was at a luau.
And 4677?
That's a birthday picture of us getting together. I don't believe that's an alcoholic beverage.
Okay. Thank you. You can take that down, ma'am. I want to talk to you about your relationship with your son. And you talked about how close you were with him, but actually, let me switch. Before I get to that, Back in July of 2012, was your son a married man?
Yes, he was.
And a wife named Cassandra?
Yes.
Did you have an opportunity over the years to see them together?
Yes.
And what kind of husband was he to her?
He was a very good husband, protective, providing.
I want to now ask about your relationship with your son. Were travel and shared activities between you and your son Alex important to you?
Very much.
Can you give us some examples of where you traveled together with him?
We went on road trips all the time. We went to two Final Fours. The first one was in Indianapolis, and the second one was in Atlanta. We went to the Rose Bowl to see Notre Dame play UCLA, so we drove from here to the coast for that. We used to go to California every Labor Day weekend to do a sports card memorabilia show with my brother Mike. And so we would do that. It was generally him and I, and then we'd go to ball games and different things like that. And going to Grandma and Grandpa's, running back and forth from there, and also seeing some basketball games. And then in the later years, he got to go, on our Vegas trips.
Vegas trips. Can you tell me about those Vegas trips?
It was 1994.
I'm going to object 401 and 403.
Will counsel please approach for a moment? Mr. Orman, you may proceed.
Thank you. Sir, I want to ask you some questions about the trips to Vegas. When did your son start going with you to Vegas?
As soon as he was 21, although I believe I took him prior to, just to kind of get him warmed up.
When he turned 21, and how old was he when he died?
27. It was his 27th birthday.
When he turned 21 and you started taking him on these trips to Vegas, did you and he, did you have to show him the ropes of how to gamble and stuff like that?
Yes.
And did he learn how to do that?
Yes.
And then did you take him there every year thereafter?
Every year we went for Super Bowl. We would get together with a group of my friends, and then as they had sons and their sons became of legal age, they started bringing their sons as well.
Since the incident at the theater on July 20th of 2012 for the 2013 and 2014 Super Bowls, have you been able to take your son to Las Vegas?
No, I have not.
And do you miss him because he can't be there?
We have an empty seat at our table, and there's a glass of Jameson sitting in front of it.
Was that what he liked to drink?
We all do.
Was there anywhere in particular that you and your son had talked about going together that meant a lot to you that you can't do now?
We had always talked about going to Ireland.
Sullivan, is that a Welsh name?
It's Irish.
Did you and your son have any interests in music together?
Yes, we did.
Were there any particular bands that you liked to go together to when they came to town?
U2 is our favorite.
When you would go to U2 concerts with your son, was there any special moments that you can remember from those concerts that relate to you and your son, Alex?
I had taught both of my kids about their Irish heritage, and when they would sing the song "Sunday Bloody Sunday," that meant a lot to us, and we would generally stand up and sing that song together, whenever they played it.
Have you been to a U2 concert since?
U2 came on June the 7th and played at the Pepsi Center, and this year when they sang Sunday Bloody Sunday, I sat there and sang the song, alone.
I want to switch what we've been talking about and ask you about the morning of July 20th of 2012. But first I want to ask you, had you ever been to the Century 16 Theater with your son Alex before this happened?
Yes, we've been there several times.
Since this has happened, have you been back to the theater?
Yes, we have.
Do you do anything to commemorate your son when you go?
Well, we make sure that the shows that we see are in Theater I, which was previously Theater 9.
Judge, I'm going to object 401 and 403.
Overruled.
What do you do when you go to Theater I, which used to be Theater 9?
And we go up and we sit in Alex's row, and we're sitting in row 12, and we leave seat 12 open for Alex, and the other three of us, or if it's just me, we sit next to him.
I want to go back to when you're working at the post office. I want to go back to the early morning of July 20th of 2012. What post office were you working at?
I work at the time I was at the Altura Post Office, which is at the corner of Colfax and Chambers.
What did you do for the post office?
At that point, I was the opening clerk. It was the through parcels.
What was your shift?
4 a.m. to 12:30.
Do you remember what time you got up in the morning on July 20th?
My alarm has been set for 2:40 a.m. For up to that time, probably the previous 7 years.
So
2:40 a.m. is when I wake up.
Before you left the house to go to work, did you get any news about the incident at the theater?
My normal routine would be to get up, get showered, changed, come downstairs, make coffee, get my lunch together, have something to eat, and then I would turn on the TV, generally on SportsCenter, to get the scores, because I'd been asleep since 7 o'clock, so I didn't know how anything ended up. But that day, we had been watching, apparently, a news program, and when I turned the TV on, the lights were flashing, and they were out in front of the Century 16 Theater.
Now, had you known that your son had gone to the movies that night?
I had an inkling that he was going. He certainly would have gone, but I had no idea what theater he was going to.
Did you do anything at that point to try to contact your son, Alex?
Well, I initially watched some of the report, and then his mom was upstairs sleeping, So I didn't want to wake her to tell her about it, so I called Alex. And his phone rang, and then I got his voicemail. And I then said, there's been a shooting. I just want to make sure you're okay. I assume you're on some kind of a sleep mode here. When you get this, give me a call so I can tell your mom. And then I wished him happy birthday.
Do you remember when one of the officers testified about the cell phones going off when he was in the theater?
Yes.
Based on what you know, would one of those calls have been you?
Yeah, that was me every half hour from 3:15 until probably 6:30 when I got the message from my wife, Terry.
Now, what time did you got to work that day?
I started at 4.
At some point, did you get a phone call?
Yes, Terry, my wife called me it was approximately 6:30.
In the morning?
In the morning, right.
And as a result of that phone call, did you leave work and go somewhere else and take other actions?
Right. I initially was trying to calm her down, letting her know that I had been calling Alex all morning and he's just sleeping and we'll hear from him. And she screamed out over the phone that Alex had been shot. And then she said, get to Gateway. And so Gateway is just down the street from where I worked, and jumped in the car and cried the whole way.
That's Gateway High School?
Gateway High School. Mm-hmm.
How long do you think it took you to get to Gateway High School?
Oh, less than 5 minutes.
Did you meet anyone at Gateway that you already knew? I mean, were your family there, friends of your son, anything like that?
I had no idea what I was running into, and I recall having, reaching and pulling my driver's license out because I didn't know who they were letting in. And I ran in through the door with my driver's license, telling them who I was. And the first person I met was Carol O'Shea and I come to find out she was with the Victim Advocates for Aurora Police Department.
Did you, at that point, at that early hour in the morning, get any information about your son when you went to Gateway High School?
No.
At some point then that morning, did you decide that you were going to go to area hospitals to see if your son was there?
Yes.
Before you did that, did you take any action to try to get the public or other people to help you get information about your son?
We had printed out a photo of him similar to one of these, and when I said to Carol, I think I need to go to the hospitals because they're not giving out any information to someone else. She asked if I'd wanted a police officer to take me, and I said that would be great. And we walked outside, and the police officer had to go back in for a reason, and I was standing out there, and I saw all of the media people on the side, and I said to Carson, one of Alex's friends.
Judge, I'm going to object to hearsay.
It's not offered for the truth of the matter asserted, Your Honor. There is no truth of the matter asserted. It's simply offered to show what he did to find his son.
Overruled.
And I said to Carson, I'm going to put these people to work. And so I ran over to the mass of media there holding up Alex's picture. And I said, I can't find him. I said, I don't know where he is. And I said, would you please help me? And I said, I think he was in the theater, but if anybody knows, please have him call me. And I shouted out my phone number, and they started to pull me away. And I told him, I said, it's his birthday, for God's sakes.
After that, did you actually go to some local hospitals?
We went to 2 different hospitals.
Which ones did you go to?
We went to Aurora South, and then while we were on our way to university, we were directed to go to Swedish, and that's where I went last.
In Swedish, that's in Inglewood?
Yes, yes.
What time do you think you got to Swedish?
Judge, can we approach, please?
Yes. Mr. Orman, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, I want to ask you about Swedish. What time did you get there?
Must have been shortly before 10 o'clock.
And did you find out that your son wasn't there?
Yes.
And at some point, did someone say, hey, let me call a local hospital, see if he's anywhere. You don't need to drive around.
Yes.
And after that, did you find out he wasn't at any local hospital?
I was told he hadn't been at any of the, I think it was 9 hospitals.
At that point, did you conclude that he was probably gone?
I decided at that point that I needed to get back to Gateway High School because I needed to tell his mother and his sister that he was still in the movie theater and that he wasn't going to be walking out.
I want to flash forward a little bit. At some point, you must have received official confirmation about the death of your son. Is that right?
8:10 p.m.
And where did that happen?
At Aurora South.
And why were you there?
Alex's wife had been admitted to the hospital.
And who was with you?
My wife and my daughter and about 25 of our dearest friends.
Did you and your son have any sort of particular inside way that you would say goodbye to each other?
Yes, we did.
What was that?
I would say War Eagle.
Is that associated with the Auburn University football team?
Yes, it is.
Did you go to Auburn?
No, I did not.
How'd you get that?
I was watching obviously an Auburn football game one day, and there's apparently a code word that you have to use in the state of Alabama to move around because there's apparently another school in the state of Alabama that also plays football. And so you say War Eagle, and if the person says War Eagle back to you, then you're able, to move on.
Did you adopt that with your son?
Yes, I did.
I want to go to July 21st, the day after. Did you think it was important to see your son that day?
Yes.
And did you do that?
Yes, I did.
Did that happen at the coroner's office?
Yes.
When you saw him at the coroner's office, did you say anything to him?
Well, I was taken into the room to see him, and I let him know that I was okay and that we were all right, and that I would go back to tell his sister and his mom that they would get to see the same Alex they had seen before. And as I walked out the door, I turned back to him and said, War Eagle.
Do you miss that? Being able to say that?
Yes.
I just have a few more questions for you, Mr. Sullivan. When, after your son died, was there a viewing for him?
Yes, at the Horan and McConty there on Dartmouth and Parker.
And while you were there, did you see any people from your son's schooling or anything like that come to the viewing?
Yes.
Section 401, 403.
Overruled.
Who did you see? And you don't need to give
Yes.
me names, but the types of people that you saw.
Second, third grade teachers came by, T-ball coach, his wrestling coach, most of his wrestling team from Grandview. Of course, the people that we buy our cigars from, they came by.
Was there a funeral?
Yes,
Who gave the eulogy?
at St. Michael's, I did.
Do you know how many people came?
Alex outdrew the Archbishop. You couldn't have fit another person in there.
You talked a little bit before about the relationship between your son, Alex Sullivan, and his sister, Megan. What impact has the crime had on Megan? And
Well-
I'm not going to say Megan Sullivan because I'm not sure of her last name now. So what is her last name now?
It's hyphened now, Sullivan Jenks, because Alex was the last of the line of Sullivans from mine, and so we got the approval from the other side that they could hyphen it, so the Sullivan name will still live on.
What has been the impact on Megan for this crime?
Well, she had a wedding on just Saturday, and her brother wasn't there. She had always planned for her brother to be with her through all of the important days of her life, and he wasn't there.
How about the impact on your son's, Alex's mom? What has the impact been on her?
Well, Terry and I she's been my girlfriend since I was 12 years old, so we've been together for a really long time. And in the past 3 years, we've had conversations that I couldn't even fathom, having had before. And we're much more watchful of each other. There's too many of those where you just look at one another and, what? And that's how you communicate.
How about you? I mean, you've talked about not being able to go to Las Vegas or do singing Sunday Bloody Sunday at a U2 concert, but the personal impact on you. What personal impact has this had on you?
Well, I think I'm one of those guys, one of those who has that Peter Pan syndrome, one of the guys who never wants to grow up. And Terry kind of got tired of it, but then Alex came along, so I had somebody new to do that. So as we, grew older, we never had to grow up. But on the morning that he was murdered, I was forced then to have to grow up. And so from this point on, all I'm doing is getting older.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Ms. Brady, do you have any cross-examination for Mr. Sullivan?
No, sir.
And the jury does not appear to have any questions. May Mr. Sullivan be released from his subpoena?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, sir.
All right, Mr. Sullivan, thank you.
Thank you.
Would counsel approach, please, Mr. Brockler and Ms. Brady for just a moment? Members of the jury, let's go ahead and take an early lunch break. It's 11:35. It's close enough anyway. Let's take our usual time, an hour and a half. Please make sure that you follow all my admonishments during the break. And members of the jury, before your break, I want to remind you that you may not be swayed by emotion. Your decisions in this sentencing hearing may not be the result of any irrational or arbitrary emotional response. Rather, each of your final sentencing verdicts must reflect your individual reasoned moral judgment. Does everyone understand that? And everyone's nodding their head and saying yes. All right. Have a good lunch. I'll see you back here in an hour and a half. Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom now. Is there anything that we need to talk about at this time outside the presence of the jury? On behalf of the prosecution, Mr. Brockler?
No, sir, thank you.
On behalf of the defense, Ms. Brady? All right, enjoy your lunch. I'll see you back here in an hour and a half. Thank you. The court will be in recess.